Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support. As a small nonprofit, we depend on your viewership and contributions. We are committed to bringing you a rich lineup of programs on the most compelling and timely issues. Please consider becoming a member of the Council Town Hall. You can check out all the member benefits on our website at lawacth.org. And stay tuned at the end of today's program to hear about our upcoming programs. For those of you who would like to submit questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America, with Alec MacGillis. He's at ProPublica. He's a journalist and author of his entitled Fulfillment, which is an investigative story in the age of one-click America. Alec will be joined by Carolyn Kellogg, writer, critic, and an editor. She's a former book editor of the Los Angeles Times. Just a note, you can purchase Alec's book at Chevalier's bookstore, which is the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. There's information on how to buy it through Chevalier's on our website. So without further ado, Carolyn, I'd like to bring you on. We're so appreciative of you moderating today's program.
Thanks, Kim.
And I'll let you bring Alec on and I'll let you get the program started. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Alec, join us. I think you're muted. Say something.
Yeah, I got it. Here we go.
Okay,
All set.
excellent. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, this is Alec's book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. The book does an amazing job of atomizing a number of economic forces that are driving America apart into sort of winners and losers, especially like 1% and everybody else. And all of these various economic forces in the book, Amazon is kind of at the center. And I wonder, Alec, in writing a book about Amazon, why you chose to leave Amazon out of the title?
Well, thanks. Very good question. And first of all, thank you so much, Carolyn, for moderating this. It's great to have you here as part of this. You understood the book very, very well, as from a wonderful review that you wrote in the LA Times. And thank you also to the council, to Kim and the rest of the council and town hall for having this. It's really good to be here. I'm sorry that I can't be there physically. It's been sort of hard with this sort of virtual book tour not to be able to be in places because the book is about places. So it's too bad not to get to go to places. But perhaps when the paperback comes out next year, we'll be in a better situation. So one reason the book does not have Amazon in the title is that the book actually did not even start out being about Amazon per se. I started out wanting to write a book about disparities in America, specifically regional disparities. We've had a lot of talk about income inequality among individuals, the sort of 1%, 99% and all that. But what I've been noticing as a reporter going around the country these last 10, 15 years are these incredibly growing regional disparities, the growing gaps in our landscape, in our geography between sort of winner-take-all cities like Seattle, San Francisco, New York, DC, Boston, arguably LA, and then a whole bunch of sort of left-behind cities and towns. And I wanted to write about that, as those disparities I found them very upsetting to sort of see as I went around the country. I thought they were having a really distorting effect on our politics, as the 2016 election kind of showed. And so I wanted to write about that. And then it took me about a year of thinking about different ways to frame that issue. And I finally settled on Amazon as the frame. And I settled on it as the frame for two reasons. One is that the company is so ubiquitous everywhere in our life now in America that it's just a handy thread to take you around the country. It's as a sort of metaphor for what we're becoming as a country and as a society, because it is just everywhere. But more importantly, it's a good frame because it is itself contributing to these regional disparities. One big reason that we have such concentration of wealth in certain places in our country is that we have such concentration of our economy in certain companies and certain sectors. So it works very well as a frame in that sense. So I settled on fulfillment. Actually, fulfillment was my title right from the get-go. That word to me, the double meanings of that word, actually more than double meanings. There's just so many different sort of resonances of that word, and one of which, of course, is Amazon's term for the job of fulfilling orders in the warehouses, and they're called fulfillment centers. And that, so right from the start, I knew that was a good way to have good thing to call a book that was sort of about Amazon, but actually about much more. It was really about the whole country.
So I wondered if we could start by talking about Seattle, because anyone who has been to Seattle sort of in before Amazon and after Amazon can see the massive transformation of that city. And in some ways, it feels as though what has happened to Seattle is just simple gentrification, almost inevitable. But in other ways, it's kind of not. And I wonder if you could talk at first about like Seattle's history and the part of the city that you decided to focus on in the book.
Sure, it's a good place to start because it's the first chapter of the book. It's where the book starts, because and it made sense to start there because of course that's where Amazon is based. And what I found in my reporting in Seattle is that this is sort of key to the whole book, is that these disparities are not just unhealthy for the left behind places. They're obviously dealing with blight and abandonment and despair of various sorts, and sadness and people leaving and depopulation, but it's also unhealthy for the winter cities like Seattle that end up dealing with just what I call hyper prosperity, just all these dynamics of effects of just so much wealth concentrated in one place. So you end up with incredible housing affordability, homelessness, displacement, loss of character, congestion. And Seattle has all these things in spades. And I focus in Seattle on the historically Black neighborhood in Seattle called the Central District. I think a lot of people are not aware that Seattle had an incredibly thriving Black community. And we think of it as so far, north in a way, that we don't think of it as having had that element. But in fact, Seattle got its own, quite large share of people coming up from mainly in the Great Migration, and sort of peaking around the time of World War II, when you had a lot of work in the shipyards during the war. And so you ended up with this incredibly vibrant community that was, through various kinds of redlining and discrimination, housing discrimination, ended up mostly in this one part of town, the Central District, and ended up with, it's one feature of it was this just incredible music scene, just all these nightclubs, after hours clubs, and a whole bunch of famous people that came out of there. Quincy Jones, Ernestine Anderson, and Jimi Hendrix, among others. And now what you've now seen is the almost total erasure of that neighborhood. You go there now, and it is really hard to believe, especially if you're coming from the city where I live. I live in Baltimore, and you have certain image of what a historically Black neighborhood looks like. You go to Seattle, and you almost wonder, am I in the right place? Because this is just gentrification does not really suffice to describe what's happened there. And the reason for this is just that you've had primarily through Amazon, just such an extraordinary injection of wealth and prosperity that a neighborhood like the Central District basically didn't stand a chance. It's actually quite lovely neighborhood, pretty near to downtown, pretty near to the Amazon campus, and now you've got these little arts and crafts bungalows there that are going for $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. And how this happened is pretty simple. You had, this is how things happen. This is why how you end up with these winner-take-all cities. You had Microsoft starts in Seattle because Bill Gates and Paul Allen are from Seattle. So they started their company in Albuquerque. They kind of missed home and had trouble hiring people to come to Albuquerque. So they move back to Seattle, and they start their company there. And then when it comes time for Jeff Bezos to decide where he wants to start his company, he has no personal association with Seattle, but he goes to Seattle, because it's tax advantageous for taxes to go there instead of going to Silicon Valley, where he also could have gone. But he goes there, secondly, because Microsoft's already there, so he can draw tech talent off of Microsoft. And that's the way things happen in the tech economy. It's agglomerating. Everyone wants to be sort of in the same place because you want to be able to get that skilled workforce. It's all about the human capital and getting that human capital. And so you end up with this kind of natural clustering effect. And that's sort of a natural effect. But what's made it unnatural now, and why you end up with so much wealth in a place like Seattle, is that the winner companies have been allowed to get so enormous that where a single company like Amazon happens to be ends up mattering a ton. And so you end up with Amazon now with 50,000 employees in Seattle alone. They're going to grow to, they're going to get another 25,000 across the lake in Bellevue. And so it just becomes this extraordinary winner-take-all kind of effect. And then a city like Seattle, it can just be utterly transformed essentially by a single company.
And yet, at the same time, there were activists. There's an activist named Katie Wilson with a organization, Housing for All. And one of the things your book does really well is it takes these economic forces but personalizes them. So we get to meet like some of the people who live, and like a woman who ran a choir in Seattle for 2 decades, or there's like real human stories inside of these bigger stories. And one is following this activist who is supporting Housing for All. She's been trying to get the tech companies to support low-income housing and getting homeless people off the street. And so finally, they got the city council in Seattle to agree to help pay some taxes to ameliorate this problem.
Yes.
Then what happened?
Then it was an extraordinary moment, and I happened to be in Seattle when this all kind of went down. It was wild to watch it happening. There was this big push to pass a tax for housing and homelessness services because Seattle ended up with really like the second or third worst homelessness problem in the country, right up there with San Francisco and LA. And so the progressive members of the city council and activists like Katie pushed to get this tax passed. And it was a tax on large employers, most notably Amazon. And Amazon actually came to the bargaining table with the mayor, sort of centrist mayor, and they settled on a smaller sum for the tax, a tax that Amazon said they could live with. And it was really, for a company their size and wealth, it was a pittance. And so the tax was only going to raise so much money, but it was something, and it was a start. And 2 days after the mayor signed this new tax, this new law into effect, a big repeal referendum gets launched, effort to get a repeal of this new tax on the November ballot, funded by Amazon and other companies. So just really just moments after having agreed to this compromise, they set out to kill the new tax. And the progressive council members were just stunned. They thought they had a deal. And then what happened is that Amazon, through its very large spending on pushing for this repeal referendum, managed to turn the public. Polling showed that they managed to turn the public against this new tax. And they did that not just through spending heavily on PR and all that, but because they really did manage to tap into something kind of ugly and toxic in the local politics, where even in a liberal city like Seattle, a city that voted 93% for Hillary Clinton, you end up with really some kind of ugly strains where Amazon is basically able to make the case that, look, all this tax money will be wasted by the government. They clearly have failed on homelessness. They're not going to know what to do with it. We can't trust them. A real kind of anti-government message. And also, do you really want to have new housing or maybe a new shelter built in your nice neighborhood? and a real kind of tapping into this kind of NIMBY fears in the city, and then on top of that, threatening to leave the city, threatening to sort of slow its growth in the city if this tax stands. And so for a lot of liberal Seattleites, suddenly feeling, oh gosh, here's this golden goose that we know they're kind of a big scary company, but man, they are also the reason why my little bungalow that I bought for $200,000 is now worth $1 million. And I kind of like that. I like this new prosperity. And so voters turned against this new tax, and the city council actually repealed it before it even went on the ballot. They just flat out, just a month after they passed the law, they turned around and repealed it. It was a very kind of really sort of dark political chapter for the city.
I'm still on mute. I wonder, I know we don't have much time, but I'm also curious. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about one of the places that's left behind that you write about, which is Ohio, and also
Sure.
because Ohio, I think, is politically vital to sort of the future of the country. It's this swing state. Is it going to go red? Is it going to go blue? It used to be such a Democratic powerhouse, and now it seems like it's sort of up for grabs. And part of that is because of the economic straits that is happening. So first, you write really beautifully about Dayton, which I had never thought of Dayton as a beautiful place, but I came away thinking of Dayton as beautiful. And I understand that you went there for a TV project. Could you talk a little bit about, like, sort of how, was that the first time you went to the city, and how did it inform the book?
Sure. Dayton, I've spent a lot of time in Dayton. I started going there as a reporter way back in 2012, was my first time doing a political story there, and I kept going back to it. And in 16, I was in Dayton a lot, in early 16, doing a big piece about the politics of Ohio, based in Dayton, and it was there that I really saw the Trump wave starting in Dayton and Southwest Ohio, very early in 2016. So I did some big stories about the Trump phenomenon, and sort of explaining in a very deep way how it was all kind of rooted in what had been happening economically in places like Dayton. And then I went back to Dayton to do a documentary with PBS Frontline, which you can still find online. It was called Left Behind America, 52-minute documentary on the city. And it was while we were filming that documentary that I met in a pretty remarkable family, a young family that was living in a shelter in Dayton, despite the fact that the father had a job, and at the time he was working as a cardboard box maker. And this was after a whole string of other low-wage jobs. His father had run a small trucking company that had transported auto parts up and down the sort of auto industry corridor in Ohio and Michigan, but he lost that business during the Great Recession, before the Great Recession, and his son Todd was left really kind of to fend for himself, spends his whole 20s going through all these different low-wage jobs, finally ends up making cardboard boxes, living in the shelter. And it dawned on me, I asked him, I said, Todd, who do you make the boxes for? And I said, well, we're not supposed to talk about that. And I finally said, well, do you make them for the company that, the most obvious cardboard box user? And he said, yeah, of course. And so right there, it's just as I was thinking about making this book with an Amazon frame, and I thought, oh my gosh, here we are. This is sort of the very bottom of this whole ecosystem, this economic ecosystem that stretches all the way up to Jeff Bezos, the zillionaire. You have the man making cardboard boxes for $10 or $11 an hour, living in a homeless shelter. And so that's how I came to sort of build that chapter around Todd and around Dayton. Dayton is just a fascinating city that truly was sort of the Silicon Valley of its time. The Wright brothers, all these other inventors and innovators, industrial innovators that came out of Dayton in the late 19th century, early 20th century. National Cash Register, all these great sort of iconic American companies, and it has gone through such a hard time, which actually and it got much worse just in the first decade of this century. The decline really kind of accelerated, and now the city is largely based around logistics. Because it's centrally located, it's become sort of a logistics town. You make cardboard, you package stuff, you drive stuff, a lot of trucking there, but it's all just packing, moving things that were made elsewhere for the most part. And so that the story of that transformation of a place like that it was to me really kind of core to the book.
So well, Amazon is creating all this wealth at the top for Jeff Bezos and for all of those programmers that are working in Seattle. Although I know that not all of them are making bank like him.
Yes.
Why do you think it is that that wealth can't be shared? Were we better 50 years ago at creating middle-class jobs that had better benefits, that had better wages, where people could support a family?
Yes, there were two. I would say there are two different main strands to this. One is of course the strength of unions and the incredible decline of unions, especially private sector unions, in these last few decades. And I kind of tell that story in the book through the transformation of another place, namely a peninsula outside Baltimore called Sparrows Point, that once had the biggest steel mill in the entire world, 30,000 people making really good money, very dangerous work, but making good money doing that work. And it has now been wiped clean off the face of the earth. Bethlehem Steel is gone, and it's been replaced by a business park with warehouses. It's a logistics business park, including 2 Amazon warehouses. And you're now essentially back to almost square one in this exact same piece of land where in the early 1900s, you had work there that was very low paid, very dangerous at the steel mill, and then they got unionized, and those jobs got lifted up to something that could sustain a family and a middle class life. And now we're basically back to square one with these jobs that are not paid enough, incredibly high pressure, with plutocratic zillionaire owners and no union representation. So that's part of that story of how we ended up with that extraordinary inequality. And the fight in Bessemer, Alabama is proof of just how tough it's going to be to kind of turn the cycle, hopefully to the point where these warehouse jobs, which are now kind of the mass employment option for a whole bunch of Americans, can be something that's more sustainable and better paid. But the other half of it is monopoly, that we have allowed. Early in the 20th century, again, it's like the cycles are turning again. Early 20th century, we had these extraordinary monopolies. Standard Oil, classic example, and where John Rockefeller owned both the railroads and then controlled a lot of the oil companies that were moving the oil on the railroads. And then so if you were a rival oil producer, he wasn't going to let you on the rails unless you paid extortionary prices, that kind of thing. And we have now a similar situation again. We had, over the 20th century, in the early 20th century, we took on those monopolies, and there was a whole sort of regime for decades of very aggressive antitrust enforcement, and we allowed that to wither over in the final decades of the century. And so now we're back, in a sense, to this extraordinary concentration. And so I see, the book is not an argument book. It does not have clear chapter on solutions or anything like that. But I do see there being 2 main strands of fixes now, which is one is worker rights and unionization. The other is the antitrust fight that is looming in Washington, and there is an actual debate now, and there is actual signs of movement on that front.
Because you brought up Bessemer, I know, because I used to live in Alabama, I was following that very closely. One of the things that Amazon said was, oh, we pay our people $15, but people at the neighboring warehouses in that part of Alabama actually made like $17 an hour.
Yes.
So it seemed like Amazon was pretty good at a misinformation campaign, but there was a lot of other stuff that they did that was really crazy. And I wonder if you have a second to talk about that. Why does this, it blows me away that a company this huge is so miserly about just sharing its wealth with its own workers. Why is it so hard?
Exactly. I mean, just to think that they actually tacked on $2 more early in the pandemic. I don't know if you remember this, but they raised that minimum from 15 to 17 early in the pandemic. It was supposed to be just kind of, it's kind of hardship pay, because it was scary being in the warehouses when COVID was first breaking out there. And and they were worried about losing workers, and they were seeing this huge surge in orders already, and they needed more workers, so they bumped up pay for $17. But then they took it away. They took it away like it was by like May, it was gone. So yeah, why at a time when the company, I mean, it's hard. You say these things and you sound like you're being sort of oversimplifying, but it's really, the numbers are astonishing. I mean, at a time when the company sales were up 40% year over year, it was already huge, got 40% bigger. Bezos's personal wealth increased $58 billion in the course of a year. Stock was up 85%. Over that period of time, they could not raise up $15. Just yesterday, they announced that they're going to be giving existing workers some raises, but they're still going to leave the minimum at $15 an hour. And then all the other things that happened in that election, where it was really kind of astonishing to watch. Even things like getting the town, the Bessemer, getting the municipal officials to change the stoplight timing at the gate, at the warehouse entrance, so that workers who were trying to hand out union literature would have less time to talk to workers at the red light. There's this controversy over the mailbox, putting a mailbox, getting the post office to put a mailbox on the property there for workers to drop off their mail-in ballots, which the union felt was an attempt to make it seem as if Amazon was actually sort of overseeing and monitoring the vote. And then of course the captive meetings, constant meetings within the warehouse where your workers are just getting hit with anti-union propaganda, and the union does not have a chance for any kind of similar kind of group access to the workers. I mean, our laws for decades now in this country are very slanted against union organizing, going all the way back to Taft-Hartley law in the early 50s. And there's been these efforts to change those laws, but they always run up against the filibuster. And we're at that point again now. There's a law that has passed the House that would make it a lot easier to organize, but it's not going to be able to get over the filibuster.
And your first book was about, speaking of the filibuster, yes. I should mention your first book was about Mitch McConnell.
Correct. Yes, that was called The Cynic.
So I wonder if, in your book, you sort of go into this in great detail, that Amazon is, and it has to do with these two different places, right? The winning places and the losing places. Amazon situates warehouses all over the place where it can get property for cheap, where it's got access to transportation, where it can get cheap labor, like people who work for, and cheap labor that will not try to organize, they hope. But often it is sort of putting its thumb on the scale behind the scenes. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the ways that Amazon is pulling the strings so that it's not just basic competition. Like they're not just going up against Macy's for a new corner shop or storage area.
Right. Well, there's so much behind the scenes, and a lot of my reporting was just straight up investigative reporting of trying to get emails between the company and local officials and that sort of thing. And I found some really just astonishing exchanges. One of the thumbs on the scales that they do, of course, is trying to get tax subsidies from the communities that they go into. Just this constant campaign to get any kind of tax breaks that they can, and basically saying we're not going to come in with our warehouse or our data center unless you give us millions in tax breaks, which is especially confounding that the communities go for it, because the company really does have to be in certain places now to fulfill its promise of 1 or 2 day delivery. And so it's not like if you say, no, we're not going to give you those breaks, that they can just go down to Alabama. They need to be in Baltimore or Ohio or what have you. So there's constant push for those tax breaks. They have an entire division dedicated to getting tax breaks out of local towns and cities, and they call it the Department of Economic Development, which I find just glorious. And also just constant demands of secrecy in those negotiations, where towns have to swear not to cough up anything. to local reporters, if there are any local reporters even left. But then the other, sort of the hands on the scale that's more sort of directly anti-competitive is something I devoted a whole chapter to, which is the incredible pressure on small businesses to basically throw in the towel and join Amazon, start selling their goods on the marketplace, which is the sort of the name for the Amazon website for with third-party sellers, small businesses who I focus on office supply dealers in El Paso, Dunder Mifflin's of El Paso, and who have always for years now sold paper and pencils and printer cartridges to local businesses and local schools and local government, and now come under incredible pressure from Amazon to start selling through the Amazon website instead. And then Amazon goes to them and says, why don't you just sell through the website? The whole world is there. You can sell to the whole world. And then they go to their customers, the schools and the city hall and local businesses, and say, hey, just start buying all your stuff, your supplies on Amazon. Just easier, just like you buy your own stuff there. And what that misses, of course, is that going through the marketplace means that those local offices, those local businesses have to give up at least 15% of their revenues to Amazon as the middleman. And in many cases, it actually ranges much higher, like all the way up to 30%. But Amazon has been so successful with that kind of push, that kind of coercion, that now well over half of the stuff that's sold on Amazon is third-party sellers. It's these companies that are simply there to sell through the website and then give up a big cut to Amazon as the platform. And it's hugely lucrative for the company. It's much more lucrative than the stuff that they just sell, as a retailer who gets stuff from the wholesaler and sells it on the site.
And at the same time, then the local communities lose on the sales tax.
Right.
For the most part, right?
Exactly. They lose on the sales tax. They lose all other taxes, right? Because the more money that goes to Seattle instead of staying in El Paso, the less, the more money that office supply dealer has to give up to Amazon. That money's going straight to Seattle. It's going to Jeff Bezos instead of staying in the local community and being paid, and having that local business person pay taxes on that locally. It's just this constant sort of undermining and degradation of the local place, both the tax base and then just more generally the fabric more generally. The fact that local commerce is no longer happening between us, fellow citizens in our town, but is all kind of just going through this kind of virtual space that is taking its cut.
And when we're talking about that with the warehouses, if Fishkill, New York, in the Hudson Valley, where I was driving and I was like, is that an Amazon sign? Has a huge warehouse and they get a $20 million tax break, that means that Fishkill still has to pay to repair its own streets, still has to, there's a lot of wear and tear on the community that Amazon is creating, but is not helping to support, right?
Right, all that truck traffic, all the calls to first responders to come for all the injuries that happen at the warehouses, just this constant stream of someone broke a wrist, there are a lot of, it's not as dangerous of course as the steel mill was back in the day, but there are plenty of injuries, including some fatalities. I wrote in the book about 2 fatalities that happened at the exact same warehouse in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Wrote about another accident in a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, outside Columbus, where the company was so short on people to drive forklifts that they assigned 2 legally blind people to drive forklifts, and not surprisingly, one of them had a crash in the warehouse. And so you have fire and EMS have to come for that kind of stuff, but they're not being paid by the company that is creating this demand for service.
Okay, I know we've got some questions from the audience, but I have one that I want to come back to, but if Jessica is okay. Jessica, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Okay, are you ready to join us with some audience questions?
Sure, I can. Or if you wanted to ask one more, I can wait a moment, whatever you prefer.
I want to save mine for later.
Okay,
Yes.
fair enough. I will make sure we have enough time. Well, thank you both. Let's just get started. So the first question, Alec, do you believe Jeff Bezos is aware of Amazon's imprint on economic inequality?
Oof. Boy. I always have to be careful about, sort of trying to guess what it's in other people's minds. But from having watched him, I think like a lot of these guys, he just takes enormous pride in what he's created, and he really does believe that it's all for the good, and that he has created just this extraordinary wealth for himself and for shareholders, and that he is really quite removed from all of these different downstream effects. One of the most remarkable moments in reporting was going to a gala dinner in DC that was hosted for him by sort of an occasional meeting of local power folks, power elite. And he was up there on stage with David Rubenstein, big private equity guy, very wealthy man himself. And they were just up there on stage for minutes. They were just joking back and forth about their extraordinary wealth, and about the fact that Bezos had just become the wealthiest man in the world after having been the second wealthiest, and what's it like being the wealthiest versus the second wealthiest, and then it was really kind of grotesque to watch. And then Bezos kind of went from there into a whole, try to realize that it was starting to get a little bit icky, and start talking about that's not just his own wealth that's been massively increased, but that the company has created this incredible wealth, sort of across the board for shareholders, and there's definitely a sense of complacency there. The company itself, I mean, I did not speak to Bezos himself for the book, but I spoke to the company, of course, and their basic line in defense is an interesting one. Essentially, that we know that a lot of these jobs are not good jobs. We know that this is tough work. But it's better than nothing. A lot of these towns had no jobs, and we're coming in with a warehouse. At least that's better than something. What that overlooks, of course, is that the jobs are replacing other jobs, that retail jobs that have been wiped out, and so it's not like they're just purely new jobs. They have replaced something else. But then their second response is, look, if we're not us in this role of this big e-commerce giant, it would be someone else. There are these bigger structural forces happening in the world, technology, globalization, all that, and we just happen to be the ones who are filling this role. That's true to some extent, but I think what that overlooks is that there are specific things the company has chosen to do, ways it's chosen to behave, such as being especially aggressive in tax avoidance, or choosing to put its second headquarters in Washington, D.C. instead of a place somewhere like St. Louis that could really have used to boost, being especially demanding of workers in the warehouses, taking away that $2 bump after the pandemic. So there are things that they could have done that would actually ameliorate things somewhat.
Thank you. What can be done to offset the leverage that companies such as Amazon possess when cities such as Seattle attempt to level the socioeconomic playing field? So does it need to be at the legal, do we need to go to DC to push on this, or how do you kind of push back against these companies?
Yeah. That's a really good. I think at the end of the day, it does in a sense come back to antitrust. I have to be careful. I don't be careful not to be sort of a one-note Johnny on this. But when you allow companies to get that big and that powerful, and that you're just going to end up with a kind of a weight and a sway, especially in a place like Seattle, that is just going to be hard to fight against. And now we're going to see it again in DC. They chose Washington, DC as their second headquarters, 25,000 high-paid new jobs, billions in investment, a whole new corporate campus, not just because there's a lot of tech talent in DC for them to draw off of, but because they know that the biggest threat to them right now is in Washington, DC. It's not a corporate rival, it's the threat of federal government somehow trying to rein them in. And so they want to build up their presence in DC so that they can have sway there, kind of like they do in Seattle, where they just become sort of this big, the big employer in town. We're kind of proud of them. We've got Amazon, and so it's just tough when things get that big. They're going to have this inevitable power. That said, I don't think it's hopeless, even in the current circumstances. The fights like Katie Wilson's fight, the activist fight, do matter, and they have now, basically after the book sort of went to press, they have managed to get a sort of another version of that tax they were fighting for. They've managed to get one through after all, just after that ugly chapter. And so there still are fights to be had in activists, room for activists and reporters to expose things and fight the good fight.
Are we, the buyers, part of the problem by rushing to buy everything all the time from Amazon as if there was no other option for our purchases?
Yes, so this is the big question, right? This is the elephant in the room. This all kind of goes back to us. And the book, I avoid making, an explicit sort of moralizing point in the book about us, the consumer, but it hangs over everything. And the book is, in a sense, my attempt to sort of show the consumer what's behind that easy one click. And so I do believe, just the way I just said, that the company has some responsibility and agency, and it's not just about larger structural forces. I do believe that we as consumers also do have agency. And this past year, I mean, it was kind of extraordinary to watch, like, the alacrity with which a lot of us sort of embraced the one-click kind of way of life, even more than we had before, and even arguably maybe in excess of what was sort of required by public health demands. And it'll be really interesting to see whether we can now kind of come out of that moment and kind of re-engage with the physical world around us. Tim Wu, there's a great sort of voice in antitrust, this guy Tim Wu, who is now actually in the Biden White House, which is a interesting sign. And he had a really good piece a couple years ago about the convenience issue, right? We all say, oh, but it's just so much more convenient to buy here, to buy on Amazon. And he pointed out that what that overlooks is the cycle that happens, where now you think it's more convenient just to buy the hammer here on the site. It'll come tomorrow, instead of having to go down to the hardware store that's 3 blocks away. Well, okay, you made that convenience calculation. That hardware store is going to go out of business because everyone else is doing the same thing. Next time you want to buy a hammer, the choice is going to be online or the hardware store that's 5 miles away, 10 miles away. And so the convenient choice will keep getting more convenient because you're going to lose all your other options. And it's pretty bleak, and it's a pretty straightforward cycle. And so yes, I really do believe this book is written in a sense for that consumer. And it should be noted, by the way, that Amazon's strongest demographic, they're a universal company, of course, but their strongest demographic is with highly educated upper middle class people in blue places. So that's why you see the towers of boxes outside apartment buildings in the big cities, and or all the cardboard boxes left out on recycling day in nice neighborhoods. And a couple years ago, there was a poll, and serious poll, and Amazon, among Democrats, Amazon was the most admired institution in the country, ahead of local government, higher education, unions, the press. So there is a very strong bond between Amazon and the consumer, especially the liberal consumer.
It's really interesting about what it says about our priorities and our communities. Adding on to that comment on the cycle, did you look into the environmental impact of Amazon and this business model in terms of the creation of more waste through an addiction to easily accessible stuff, as well as the packaging materials and impact of shipping? Having some friction by having to go to a store may have been the better environmental model.
Yeah, it's a huge aspect of this whole kind of way of life. And I got into it somewhat, not as much as I might have liked. The other aspect of the environmental cost, of course, is the energy costs of these enormous data centers. I get into that somewhat in the book. I have a whole chapter on the data centers. Amazon's we haven't even talked about the whole part of the company that's all about the cloud, Amazon Web Services, and they're just these enormously energy voracious data centers that in Northern Virginia are run heavily by coal power and just huge emissions associated with them. But yeah, the packaging, one very interesting, I mentioned briefly that Amazon, a couple years ago, Amazon explored having a green option for buying goods, where you were going to agree as a consumer to a somewhat slower delivery time and less packaging, but the crucial thing was somewhat slower delivery time because it was going to be greener. And they shut that down. They before it could even become offered to consumers, they decided not to offer that. But yeah, the waste is extraordinary. There was a great line in Nomadland, the book, which the Oscar-winning movie is based on, this very good book about these sort of nomadic workers in the warehouses, and there's this, and it didn't make it into the movie, but there's a woman, one of those older women workers, just talked in the book about how she just found the work so depressing because she knew that everything she was packing, so all this, she put out like crap from China that was all going to go straight to the landfill, and yeah, that is essentially where it all goes.
Carolyn, did you want to say something? I saw you over there with some input.
Yeah, well, one of the data center, one of the things that Amazon, we can think of Amazon as being just like super good at retail and maybe a little sneaky, but one of the things that they do is that they have these massive cloud computing contracts with the US government, including like the CIA, and they've only gotten bigger over the last 5 years, like just huge. And so they can, and I know about this from the book world, they can undersell like an independent bookseller like Chevalier's,
right?
Because they don't have to make a profit off that book like the local bookseller or the local hardware store has to. And that's something that you get into in your book. And when I saw it in your book, I'm like, yes, it's not just me saying it out loud. So thank you for like writing about that.
Sure.
This next question is actually for both of you. In your reporting and meeting businesses large and small, can you share of other enterprises attempting to do the right thing and address socioeconomic inequities?
Sure. I mean, I think I found my chapter on those small businesses in El Paso actually very uplifting in a way, because they saw what was happening to them, they organized, and they really kind of fought back as much as they could, to the point of going to their local governments and local school districts and explaining to them what was happening and showing all the ill effects of going to to a full Amazon approach. And it's worth noting that there is now increasingly another option has emerged. I mean, it's always nice to like point to things that are semi-hopeful. And I have to be careful, it doesn't sound like some kind of plug for this other company, but there is now, if you're a small business person who wants to sell goods online, there's this Canadian company that has emerged as a pretty serious rival to Amazon called Shopify. And what they do is they don't have a platform that they're selling on the way Amazon does, but what they help the small business set up their own e-commerce operation under their own name on their own website, so that it's very smooth running, very seamless, and Amazonian in a sense, in its sort of and its reliability and convenience. But it's through the company, through the business themselves. They're not having to give Amazon the big cut. And it's been interesting watching that emerge as one alternative. And Amazon is actually very worried about them, and it's been working in-house to try to sort of quash that rival. So I do, again, like I said, I do think that there are companies have agency, and I do get somewhat frustrated when a lot of people just like to always go straight to the kind of systemic structural arguments for things happening certain ways. And of course, those forces are all in and around us, but businesses and business owners do still have responsibility, they have agency.
Yeah, one thing I found that I think is notable on Amazon is their rating system. And so a lot of times being able to vet a product that you don't necessarily have access to, that rating system has been really helpful. But being able to actually go to the companies themselves and do the direct purchase, sometimes they end up being more affordable than what is on Amazon. The shipping can be managed directly with that shop rather than, like you said, going through Amazon. So I highly encourage people to do that because you can build that rapport with that business and sometimes get better rates than you have available on Amazon. Alibaba is often referred to as the Amazon of China because of its growth trajectory being nearly identical to that of Amazon. Is Alibaba responsible for similar problems in China?
Wow. My knowledge of Alibaba is limited, so I should be careful not to sort of pop off on them. But yeah, but it's been very interesting watching them kind of grow in a very similar, kind of grow in parallel over on this screen. I would say on the topic of China that I should make a plug for another book that just came out just right before mine did, called Made in China, by a young journalist called Amelia Peng. And I've done a couple sessions with her about her books, and it's just an astonishing book about the forced labor in China, both going back decades, but now of course focused on the Uyghurs, but also Falun Gong followers being pressed into forced labor camps, and essentially just showing how much of the stuff on Amazon, especially the sort of cheaper stuff, the really cheap stuff like the party supplies and the Halloween decorations and that kind of stuff, how much of that stuff is actually coming from actual forced labor, like scary forced labor. And so that book kind of gives you, it sort of gives you that end of the ecosystem, the supply chain, sort of before the product gets to our shores and ends up in the fulfillment center.
Do you think that the professional, middle, and upper middle class workers at places like Amazon differ in political outlook from other younger Americans? If not, do they have any impact or influence on their companies?
Very good question. I decided not to sort of try to penetrate the headquarters staff for a couple reasons. One, because the book was not about Amazon per se, but also because there's already been very good reporting, notably by Jody Cantor in the New York Times, about the Seattle headquarters professional environment in those offices, and just showing just how, it's about 4 or 5 years ago that she wrote a pretty incredible piece showing just how high pressure and often kind of deeply unhappy the work is there. It's not just the warehouses where there's this kind of crazy pressure and expectations. What you're seeing now, like at the other tech giants, is that you do end up now with some salaried employees, professional, well-paid employees that have progressive inclinations on the environment and on workers' rights, and are speaking out. And the company's having a hard time dealing with it. Google, has already had like a small organizing unit where they've actually formed a union of sorts. And then Amazon actually just last year had to forget if they fired or if these two women quit under pressure, but these two professionals who had spoken out quite a lot over the energy use and treating the workers badly in the warehouses, and they had to leave. So it's definitely been interesting to watch how things evolve, within the company itself.
Great. This will be my last question, and Carolyn, I'll turn it back over to you. How do pay and benefits issues in this country relate to global trade picture and cost overseas?
Well, in all sorts of ways, of course. Well, going back, back to the story of Bethlehem Steel and how we ended up with, in the exact same piece of land, someone, actually the exact same person. I found that chapter is built around a man who spent 30 years working at Bethlehem Steel at that Sparrows Point Peninsula, made $35 an hour, credible benefits, stock, bonuses on top of the pay, and then after the steel mill went out of business, he came back to work at the Amazon warehouse, driving a forklift, making less than half as much as he had made at the steel mill. And the story of the decline of that steel mill, Bethlehem Steel, is sort of at the core of this book, even though it's not about Amazon. It's what became before Amazon, and that the story of that company just going bankrupt and vanishing was very much a story of global competition, because they faced, as time went on in the 20th century, faced increasing competition from Germany, Japan, and others, and then also, of course, from non-union mini mill steel mills down south. So yes, there are absolutely these, those larger forces that explain how you get from $35 an hour, Bill Bodani making $35 an hour at the mill, to then making, starting at $13 an hour as a 67-year-old driving a forklift on the exact same piece of land.
I muted. Alec, thank you so much. And Carolyn, I'm going to turn this back over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so again, this is Alec's book, which you can get if you want to avoid the Amazon ecosystem, but you're a big book fan. There's now also an alternative. It's called bookshop.org, where you can buy the book basically through your favorite independent bookstore. It's wonderful. But I wanted to ask you one last question, because you came at this from this idea of like places that are left behind, right? And Nelson, like Southeast Ohio, this town Nelsonville, you meet an extraordinary young man who like went off to college, but he came back, named Taylor Sappington. And he like works at the Texas Roadhouse, like at a shitty chain restaurant, a crappy chain restaurant, as a waiter. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about him and what it means for America when somebody like that stays, that doesn't stay in Washington where he went off to college.
Sure. Yeah, Taylor's an amazing man, and I knew I wanted to include him in the book, even though his connection to Amazon is, somewhat more distant than some other people in the book. But he's a hopeful figure, and it's important to have some hopeful people in there. He's this young man who grew up very poor in a very poor part of Southeast Ohio, Appalachian Ohio, and then got a full scholarship to George Washington University in D.C. Only lasted a couple of years there because he felt so out of place in the fancy D.C. Came back home, finished his college at Ohio University in Athens, and then decided to stay home. He could have gone anywhere. He's a very bright, talented guy. Decided to stay in Southeast Ohio and to sort of help the place where he's from. And he ran for office, ran for town council in his 5,000-person town, Nelsonville. Won a seat on the council. Did the council work well, being a waiter at the Texas Roadhouse. Fixed smartphones on the side too to make some more money. More recently, he's ended up working at Kroger as a checkout clerk, and then ran for state office, state legislature, lost that race, but now has managed to get elected as the town auditor in his town, and is just there, is deeply rooted at a time when so many people have given up on the place, and he's not only trying to help his place where he lives, place that he loves, and trying to build it back up somehow. But he's also trying to make the case to people elsewhere to not give up on his place, making the case to Democrats, essentially, elsewhere, that even though this place was a classic Obama-Trump kind of town that swung from Obama to Trump, that we not give up on it, and that we not give it up on it economically or politically, and that people who live there, that this place is not beyond redemption, and that the Democratic Party should keep caring about places like this, keep trying to win over people there, and not just cut it off. And so I find him actually very, very inspiring figure. He's just an extraordinary young man.
Okay, and so if there's, I want to say thank you to you, and I think is Kim going to come back?
Yes, she is.
Okay, so thank you, Alec, MacGillis, and congratulations on your wonderful book.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Great questions. Really, really great discussion. Thanks so much to the council for organizing this, and to all of you for watching.
Alec and Carolyn, this was such a thoughtful and sobering discussion. I think we all learned so much more from what you shared today. And I, with Carolyn, encourage you all to please purchase his book. I'm going to be going to Chevalier's bookstore right after this program and purchasing it, as I want to learn more and I want to know what I can do and what we all can do. So thank you both so very much.